Oh, okay. Hello, colleagues. Welcome. Please come inside. There are still one chair over there and a few chairs over here if you do not want to stand. And there is also, a chair over there, that side of the room. So, dear colleagues, it is my pleasure to start the session on youth engagement in science policy interfaces. My name is Olga Skoredina. I'm a science policy thematic facilitator for the Children and Youth Major Group to UNEP, and I'm also a PhD student in public policy at Northeastern University. Today, we will delve into the critical role of youth in bridging the gap between science and policy. Over the next hour, we'll explore how young people can actively contribute to science policy interfaces, ensuring more inclusive and effective environmental policies and strategies. Throughout this session, we will hear from our esteemed speakers who bring a wealth of expertise to this field. And let me first introduce Balakrishna Pisupati, who is the head of Environmental Policy Unit at UNEP, who has more than 16 years of experience in working on issues of sustainable development, environmental management, and policy development. Then we are joined by Martha Stokes, an assessment specialist at the Global Assessments Unit. She is part of the UNEP 7 Global Environment Outlook, and where she works alongside natural scientists, social scientists, and behavioral scientists to develop GEO7. Next, right behind me, is John Gachukia, a chemical engineer and a member of the Children and Youth Major Group. In December last year, he actively participated in negotiations on a new science policy panel to contribute further to the sound management of chemicals and waste and to prevent pollution that took place here in Nairobi. Joining us further is Tessa Gavers, who is a principal coordinator of the OEBG Secretariat. She joined UNEP in 2000 to work on the third Global Environment Outlook and has since focused on strengthening the science policy interface, environmental assessment, and program development and management. And online, we also have two speakers. It is Amaris Preuss, a stakeholder engagement officer at the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and Ladislaus Changa, who is a climate change expert who has been working in the area of climate, meteorology, and climate change since 1995. Currently, he is a vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So let us welcome the speakers with a round of applause. So while we are spotlighting our two online speakers, let us start with a short presentation about the science policy interfaces and how it is important in the work of UNEP. And Mr. Pisupati, can you please reflect on the importance of the science policy interfaces and what UNEP is doing to bridge the gap between science and policy uptake?
Thank you, Olga, and good afternoon, colleagues. Glad to see you after a very successful opening session for this particular Environment Assembly. I should congratulate Olga and all of you who have been planning for this session to start your deliberations or your discussions with such a heavy topic, science policy interfaces. I'm sure that several of you have heard this particular phrase, science policy interfaces, for quite some time. It's been with us for too long. And what I like to do in the next few minutes is to give you a bit of a context or an overview of what is this all about. In general, we do understand the science and the policy and the interlinkages and the interfaces. But in the context of our discussions, here as well as in the subsequent days with the UN Environment Assembly, and also provide you a quick overview of UNEP's focus on science policy interfaces. And for those of us who are practicing natural scientists, chemical engineers who come from science backgrounds, we all know the contributions science have made to society and development. But there are a few facets to science and a few facets to policy making and implementation that we should be aware of when we discuss the interfaces. The dynamics constantly are changing. The way science and policy interacts is constantly changing. But there is a third dimension to this discussion, that is society. Science is not practiced in vacuum. Policy is not made in just only based on science. Both of them respond to the needs and requirements of the society. So essentially, the context of science policy interfaces, we discuss it in the context of society and societal needs also. The last few decades, all of us have witnessed, seen how the entire fabric of society, the social sciences, and the elements of society's response to development has also significantly changed from where it was in the 50s and 60s. Thanks to social media, thanks to active engagement of different stakeholder groups, the context of these discussions have also changed. What I'd like to do is to give you very quickly a couple of examples to make you understand the dynamic of this science policy interface. 1948, we had Professor Dr. Paul Muller from Germany, from Switzerland, who actually won a Nobel Prize for discovering one of the most important chemicals on this planet called DDT, the diphenyl trichloromethane. It was a wonder chemical, helped the world save millions of lives, extensively contributed to not just human health, but also to agriculture and a number of different areas. But after a period of time, we also realized that's perhaps one of the most difficult and dangerous chemicals that ever was produced or made by man. And the reason I'm giving you that example is that science and scientists always work to find more evidence and more truth. So that's why there is a very famous phrase that says, science never lies. It only learns more as the days go by. But what happens is that by nature of science and by nature of practicing science, scientists, scientific institutions, to an extent, have a large amount of freedom to operate. That's how the academic, fraternity works, because the freedom is what really makes a lot of these things to work. Whether it is natural sciences or social sciences, there is a lot of freedom. But there is also an enormous amount of dynamism to which science is always ascribed to. For example, if you work in biological sciences or biotechnology or any of these new areas of work, you probably would have observed that the speed of developments, the speed of discoveries, the speed of inventions are almost at a breakneck speed. What was the most topical experiment and the result last week is already replaced by yet another experiment and yet another approach this week. So that's the speed with which science sort of evolves. And to a large extent, science always seeks to find the truth. That's the very basis of science. Now let's shift the gear to look at policies. Policy making is both a science and an art. Because in policy making, you are responding to a number of different needs and requirements of the scientists, of the society, of the politicians and the politics. So it's a kind of an area of work and an area of focus That to an extent is influenced by a number of different parameters and a number of different dynamics. And because policymaking involves a number of things beyond just only looking at science and scientific evidence and scientific facts, to an extent, the speed with which policymaking happens is always, or to a large extent, is relatively slow. So it's just not, you have an evidence, you publish a paper, and that becomes a protocol, and that protocol is used for an application, and you're done with it. Policymaking has a very, very different dynamic and a dimension. So one fundamental challenge, to an extent, a lot of us face is the speed with which science evolves and the speed with which policy evolves. And it is also correct to understand that it's just not science informing policy or policy making, but policy making also impacts science. We've had a number of examples. We had a number of experiences of how policy impacts science, including, for example, in the area of biotechnology. The science has evolved in the 90s, but the policies took a little bit of time to catch up. And what we see here today is a constant discussion about the science policy interface at work that gets discussed in the context of how society perceives science and policy working and delivering to what the society needs. But the challenge when you're looking at policy making is that a lot of time the discussions to develop a policy is based on science, is based on evidence. A lot of work, for example, on the assessments, for example, the global environment outlook, all the multilateral environmental agreements. Tomorrow we'll have a session discussing about multilateral environmental agreements are based on science. Science had said that this is what is working, this is not what is not working, and this is where you fix the problem. And the way you fix the problem is to develop a policy, and the policy matures into a legal or a regulatory framework. But what happens is that because of the time it takes to make a policy, the time when a policymaker or a policymaking process starts, science is at a particular stage. But by the time the policy is adopted, that branch of science has already evolved. And an example is one from a multilateral environmental agreement, for example, whether it is climate change or the biodiversity convention. Under the convention, one of the contentious issues by the biodiversity convention is on access and benefit sharing. Fundamentally, everybody agrees that if you access a resource, it is fair that when you make a profit, you share the benefit with the person or with the group providing the access. But it took about almost 15 years for us to agree on the principles of operationalizing that particular agreement. So one of the fundamental requirements for a lot of us that focus on science policy interfaces today is to work on what's the best way that we can iteratively work on capturing the best possible science, keeping our eyes and ears open as the science matures and shapes into a different form and a format, but at the same time, ensure that the policy-making process can be as quick, as short as possible, but not only that it is quick and short, but it is also as responsive and adaptive as possible as well. And this is where, when you work on science policy interfaces, you work and interface with a number of different actors, scientists, politicians, policymakers, society, all of it. So as youth, what is that you can focus on? As I said, science evolves all the time, or the relevance of that evolution has to be properly understood. So the first and foremost thing is that keep up to speed with what is happening out there. Keep your eyes and ears open. It's just not for youth. It's for people who actually also work on policy-making process. Keep reading. The second element of it is reflect. Remember, today policy-making is not a straight-jacketed approach. You can't make policy on environmental science. You can't make policy on climate change if you do not understand the implications of a number of different disciplines. So today, as much as science has evolved into very transdisciplinary in its approaches and applications, policymaking has also evolved the same way. And lastly, and importantly, is to engage. Unless you engage in the process, unless you also engage in the process of science policy interfaces to strengthen it, it's going to be too difficult in terms of understanding the dynamics of it. And from UNEP, we've been working on science policy interfaces almost time its inception in 1972. And 2022, we had the 50th anniversary of UNEP, where the member states requested UNEP to strengthen its focus on science policy interfaces. And that's why today we are focusing on broadly 2 or 3 areas of science policy interface. The first one is strengthening natural science, social sciences interfaces. If the behavior of people are not going to change, the best possible science and the best possible policies are not going to help us. So there is a need to look at some of it. We need to embrace the best technological tools and techniques available. And lastly, and importantly, is to work with the most important groups in this particular discussion, scientists, policymakers, and society, where all of them focus on a single objective, but the approaches to achieve the objectives are different. So our aim and our focus at UNEP is that how do we work together so that the approaches can meet at a common point so that the objectives can be met in the shorter time and the objectives can be more effective and responsive. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Pisapati, for exploring the dimensions of science, policy, and society interfaces, because oftentimes society is overlooked. And now let's transition to our panel discussion on existing platforms for youth engagement. And our first panelist is Martha, who is part of their Global Environment Outlook. So Martha, can you elaborate on what role can young people play in data collection and analysis for future reports, and what youth engagement opportunities exist within GEO for our engagement?
Yes, thank you, Olga, and thank you, Balakrishna, for the introduction. So first of all, it's so great to see a room so full of enthusiastic people. My name is Martha, and I'm an assessment specialist with the Global Environment Outlook report. So I'll just give you a brief background to what this report is, and then I'll explain a little bit about how youth can get involved with it, what opportunities there are for people sitting in this room, with future GEO reports as well. So the GEO report is UNEP's flagship report. So we released GEO 1 in 1997. I think, as we heard, we already have Tessa, who was involved in GEO 3, and we have colleagues in the room as well who have been involved in, sorry, it was GEO 3, wasn't it? Oh, and 2 as well. And 3, great. And so we have Dwan in the room as well, who's involved in GEO 7 and has been involved in GEO 6. And the purpose of this report, I think it does quite nicely, what Balakrishna was explaining can be a challenge for policy, which is keeping up with the latest science. What GEO does is it takes a look at all of the latest scientific evidence of what's happening in the environment, and synthesizes it into one place in a really comprehensive way to make it very accessible to policymakers, and also people in academic institutions, also people in NGOs, civil society, businesses as well. What we are trying to do with this latest GEO, in response to a request from the member states at the last YEA, is not just say what's going on in the environment, but also what we can be doing about it differently to make sure that we reach our politically agreed targets, which I think everybody is clear is high on the agenda at the moment. So it means that this GEO 7, is a very interesting report. It's very action-oriented. And again, as Balakrishna said, what we're really trying to do in this one is to look not just at the natural sciences, but the social sciences as well. So looking at how can we bring behavioral scientists into this report to make sure we're not just saying what's going on, but then what we can be doing about it. How are we bringing in people who are experts on equity to make sure that if we're looking at what we can do about the environmental crises, we're doing it in a way that is just and fair for the different communities around the world. So now I'll speak a little bit about what this report means for youth and how people, young people can be involved in it. So This report is our biggest geo that we've had to date. So we have nearly 250 authors who are experts in a range of topics, all to do with the environment and global systems from around the world. These 250 authors are split across 21 different chapters that range from things looking at, what is the state of the environment for air, for oceans and coasts, for land and soils, for fresh water, and then looking at what that means for some of our human systems, so our food systems, our energy systems, our economics and finance systems. And on top of these 250 authors, we have about 36 fellows to support these authors with different tasks, such as research for the chapters, referencing, formatting, editing, creating visuals, and I'm very pleased to see that we have one of our fellows in the room with us today. So Azil from chapter 15. And I think what's really nice about having fellows involved in the GEO7 process is that fellows are people who are early in their careers. So often people who are doing masters or PhD, or maybe are in their first couple of years in a policy institute or an environmental consulting firm. And they join the GEO process at this point in their career to support with those tasks. But what that means for them, for the fellows, is not only do you get access to this experience on one of the major global assessments, you also have access to this fantastic network of all of these experts from all around the world. You're speaking to people from different UN agencies, and I think as we've just had one of our in-person authors meetings where we all met up in Vienna, and just hearing some of the conversations that were going on between people looking at areas where they can be working together in the future was really, really inspiring and fantastic, to be honest. So another thing that we're doing this year, which I think we're all quite excited to see how it goes, is that we're introducing a new course for the fellows. So we've partnered with Peking University and we've created a course which is about a master's level course. It contains 12 modules and it's all about the science and policy interface. So the fellows in GEO7 are going to be testing out this course for us to tell us how it goes and learning things about, well, what is an integrated environmental assessment? What are the reports like GEO, IPBES, IPCC, what does that mean? And how do we take the information in these reports and translate them into policy? So who is a policymaker? How do policymakers think? And how can we be making sure that we're communicating science to them in the best way possible to turn it into action? So again, I think that's something that we've been really passionate about pushing in the GEO team to make sure that we are providing an opportunity for fellows which is just as helpful to them at that point in their careers as possible. And what's been really, really nice to see as well is that there are some people involved in the GEO process still who maybe started as fellows back in GEO 2 or 3 or even GEO 1. And over time, they've progressed to becoming a lead author for one of the chapters. And now some of them are even leading the chapters or are involved in our advisory bodies. So there's quite a clear progression of steps that people can take if they're interested in being involved in GEO or one of the major global assessments. So I'll stop there, I think. I think that's hopefully given you a bit of background about the GEO report and also how people can be involved. I'm going to stick around afterwards as well. So if anyone's interested to hear more or to know about where you can find more information about GEO, then please do come and speak to me. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Martha, for telling us about GEO. I think one of the questions that might be popping around is how to become this fellow and when is the next open call?
Yes, let me answer this very quickly. So we're nearly halfway through the GEO7 process. So there's not, I think we've really got our cohort of fellows for this round, but I really encourage everybody to keep an eye out on the GEO website. And because on there we post opportunities sometimes. And again, I can take email addresses at the end if anyone's interested in signing up to our newsletter, where we also will be posting any opportunities. So keep an eye out there, because as well as the core geos that we run, like Geo 7, Geo 6, Geo 5, etc., we sometimes also run special editions of Geo. So when Geo 6 was released a couple of years ago, in 2019, we also ran some special editions such as Geo for Youth, where some people who were fellows for Geo 6 got involved in leading the writing on Geo for Youth. And we also brought in some other young people to lead on that as well. So sometimes there are other opportunities that come up between the core Geo cycles. So yes, website, definitely keep an eye out there. And again, I can take emails for the newsletter as well.
Thank you. So now let us move to our online speakers, to Ms. Amaris from Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So thank you so much for joining us online. And it would be our great pleasure if you could elaborate on how we as young people can contribute to assessments and policy recommendations of IBES, and how can we engage further with IBES processes.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person with you today. I would really have loved it, and maybe next year. So thank you, Olga, and thank you to the speakers earlier who already gave a good background. So some of the elements I won't need to cover because we are fairly similar. And I'm actually proud to say there's a lot to say on the topic of youth and also Indigenous people and local communities' participation in IBES, and also the intersection of those two, and with fairly little time. So I'll dive right into it. Participation to IBES can be roughly categorized in three main components. First of all, it can be the contribution to an assessment. We have 3 ongoing assessments. There are 3 more upcoming, and we have 11 already under our belt. So there are many opportunities throughout the life of these assessments for participation. First, the main one as an author, and of course, these are usually top of their field researchers, and unfortunately for youth, often this means they're a little bit too early in their career for that. But just as Martha mentioned for the geo processes, IBES offers also fellowships, and these are really important opportunities in exactly the same way. For early career, there's no age limit, but usually under 35-year-olds. Who have interesting elements to bring to be brought on board. They are recognized as full authors of the assessments. They benefit of a mentorship program paired with one of the more senior experts. They benefit of a whole community of practice with alumni dialogues and collaborations even after the assessment. And so this is really a great opportunity for participation. To anticipate the question, we don't actually right now have any call open. We had a few open just at the end of 2023, but if you register on the IBES website to receive the notifications, you can receive the call for fellows for the upcoming assessments probably at the end of this year. Secondly, there are at the early segment of an assessment, there's usually a call for contributions on Indigenous and local knowledge, which is intended to bring Indigenous and local knowledge to the core of large-scale assessments, and allowing people to contribute materials that express community-based knowledge, practices, values, needs, experiences related to the assessments. They can be submitted in any language. And this year, look out for the call for the monitoring assessment. So this is another opportunity. It's very specific to Indigenous and local knowledge, but I think I wanted to raise it as a way for anyone, and this includes youth, and this includes non-Western scientists, to contribute to very specific and local knowledges to the IBES processes very early on in the assessment process. At a later stage in the assessment, youth just as anyone else can become reviewers, there are several calls for external review of the assessments, usually two, sometimes a third, during which these are external reviews, during which people are invited, and really we encourage you to become reviewers, to look at the drafts of the assessments and comment on it, provide additional knowledge, additional literature, and this is really great for again, less traditional academic, like less traditional or less formally academic, sorry, I'm a little bit sick today, groups to contribute, because you can provide additional literature that is not necessarily peer-reviewed papers. It can be, and this again brings us back to ILK knowledge. It has been all forms, including theater, poetry, songs, and oral knowledge. So these are really great moments in which you can contribute very concretely to the assessment. But we don't stop at contributions to the assessment. The second major way in which you can contribute would be in using and disseminating the findings of an assessment. And we encourage youth participation in building what we call uptake events, which is the dissemination of the findings. And we help you building those if you need to be put in relation to authors, etc. We at the Secretariat do this work. We have great examples of youth participation in policymaking, and I'm sorry, I'm going over time, but I want to highlight this one because it's one we're really quite proud of. A couple of years ago, youth in Ireland were invited to an assembly on biodiversity and ecosystems services, in which they used the findings of the global assessment, which was published in 2019, to orient their work. And these were a collective of young people aged 7 to 17 from Ireland. And just a couple of weeks ago, Ireland adopted its national biodiversity plan, and some of the recommendations that came out from that youth assembly were actually reintegrated in the biodiversity plan. So this is really some way in which you can make an impact. And just to go very quickly on the last element, you can also, as you contribute to the representativity of the ecosystem, we have a stakeholder day in which voices can be heard just a day prior to plenary. There are especially two self-organized networks, which I really invite you to join. One is the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IAFBS, and the second is the Open-Ended Network of for IBIS. Of stakeholders for IBIS. And within that second one, ONET, there is, for instance, the Young Ecosystem Services Scientists subgroup, which are almost communities of practice and spaces for exchange and knowledge and collaboration among stakeholders for IBIS. So I really, really encourage you to join, and I've run out of time, but if you can contact me and I can give you more information. And lastly, I would say to watch out for the call that will be coming out this year for the preparation of a youth forum, which might take place later on in the second or third quarter of this year. So apologies for the overtime, and I really thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Amaris, for joining us today. I'm sure we'll have some of the questions from the audience later, but now I would like to give a floor to Mr. Ladislaus Changa, who is the Vice Chair of IPCC. Mr. Changa, could you please elaborate on engagement opportunities within IPCC for early career scientists to contribute their expertise to IPCC reports, assessments, and working groups?
Yeah, thank you very much, Olga, and I would like to take this opportunity at the onset to express my appreciation and thanks for being invited in this very important session to deliver some remarks and a contribution towards strengthening the participation of youth in science policy interface, and particularly on our side, on how we strengthen the participation of young people in climate change science and in the IPCC process. I would like to start by appreciating the presentation that was made by Balakrishna, but also by Martha and Amel, which has been very insightful for me. Before I explain about the opportunity that young people can be able to tap in the IPCC, I would like to let you know that the 7th assessment cycle of the IPCC, which will be implemented for the next 7 years, 5 to 7 years, has already started. And just a few weeks ago, we approved the work program. And we agreed we are going to produce IPCC special report on climate change and cities, but also 3 working groups. That is working group 1 on a physical science basis, and also working group 2, which is about impact vulnerability and adaptation, and also working group 3 about the mitigation of climate change. But also the IPCC will be producing the methodology report on short-lived climate forces. And we also expect to have a number of workshops and also outreach events. The vision and priority for IPCC in the 7th assessment cycle that will go on for the next 7 years includes strengthening inclusivity and embracing diversity, and also in a more pronounced way, strengthen multidisciplinary and integration approach in our business. And in that regard, one of the tasks that have been assigned is to work to provide leadership in strengthening the participation of young people, youth, and including early career scientists in the IPCC process. And this work started in Dubai during COP28, where we had a series of engagement with young people, including Yungo, and trying to sensitize and inspire them to be part of the process, and which has been very well echoed by Balakrishna, calling on young people to keep reading and be part of the process. And I'm actually cementing that young people all over the world need to be part of the process, need to keep reading, and they need to be aggressive in doing that. They are most vulnerable, but they are expected to be the most valuable in terms of the climate change intervention. So the following are the opportunity that young people can be able to tap in, for example, in the next 7 years in the IPCC process. First of all, there is an opportunity which has also been shared by my colleague, we've spoken before me previously, in knowledge generation in relation to climate change science. Youth and including early career scientists can be able to participate in research and publishing paper which can be considered for assessment in the IPCC, and that contributing towards informing the international community about the best available science about climate change and the associated intervention. But also they can be able to participate as author in various IPCC reports that I've mentioned before, including in the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change on Cities, which is now underway. We are going to have a scoping meeting in April in Latvia, trying to work out the outline for that special report. And also, the young people can be able to participate as expert reviewer of the IPCC reports in various scenario and in various format. So I call upon young people to be ready to participate as reviewers to IPCC report, assessment report, which is open to all experts, including young career scientists. What you need is to keep on watching about the call from IPCC for that. But also, basing on this contribution that young people could have been made in the reviewing, they can be elevated to be contributing authors. And this is also possible, it can be done. But another point that I would like to submit for consideration for young people to consider it, including participating in preparing policy brief in relation to the IPCC report and participating in dissemination of the IPCC report. For example, young people can be able to zero in some key message from, let's say, if we consider the IPCC special report on climate change and cities, once it is out, then young people can be able to zoom in and see the message that is very relevant for young people, but also for policy making, and then zoom in and try to prepare policy brief and be able to contribute and inform policymakers, including during the UNFCCC COP meeting. But another opportunity is participate in awareness raising and sensitization about the key finding from the IPCC report. I believe that the young people can be able to make a lot of impact by carrying this awareness message, key message from the IPCC report, and sharing with policymakers and other decision makers. But while I still have the floor, there is another opportunity that is available, and I would really submit for young people to consider exploring it, which is the IPCC scholarship program, which contributes, in trying to enhance the capacity of young people all over the world, particularly in developing countries, in climate change science. So this scholarship program is available, and I would like to sensitize young people to tap in on this scholarship opportunity. So youth, you are all over the world, are the future authors, current and future authors, co-chairs, vice chairs, and chairs of IPCC. So we really encourage you to do that. Now, I would like to conclude by providing some recommendation, which I feel that can be very useful. I would like to call for CYMG, Children, Youth, and Management Group to consider being part of the process in the IPCC by putting a commitment. For example, when the IPCC's special report on climate change and cities will be out, they can consider to prepare a CYMG summary of the IPCC's special report on climate change and cities. Can be able just to pick some few key messages that are very relevant and consider to promote it further. But you also can be able to, for example, go in the 6th assessment cycle report, for example, the census report, and try to squeeze out some key message for young people and try to promote it further. But also I would try to suggest if CYMG can consider to provide awards for the best youth or young people who would be having a significant contribution in the AR7, 7th assessment cycle of the IPC, with gender consideration for both male and female. So CYMJ can consider, preparing and giving award for the young people who would have done significant work in generating more knowledge for publication, or actively who participated actively and strongly in the IPCC review, and also a greater contribution and impact in promoting the work of IPCC, but also greater contribution in raising awareness and sensitization about the key message and key finding from IPCC. And last one would be if CYMG can consider having a day, CYMG a day on climate change science, reflecting about the release of the IPCC reports, being it working group 1, working group 2, working group 3, etc. And finally, I would like to call upon your consideration for all stakeholders to continue or to consider supporting the IPCC scholarship program, which has been very valuable for supporting expert young career scientists in developing world. With that, I would like to once again thank you very much for this opportunity, and I submit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Changa, for highlighting their opportunities for youth engagement and especially for mentioning the importance of promoting their reports of science policy panels and raising awareness about the findings. And I recall that GEO6 has a special report with youth-friendly language. So this can be a good practice to uptake in further assessments of different science policy panels. And since we are talking about youth engagement, let us turn to our youth speaker, John. So John, what is your reflection on the discussion today? And what are the youth priorities for engaging in science policy panels, and especially in their new panel on chemicals, waste, and pollution?
Hello, everyone. I think this is a very great number I'm seeing. Thank you so much for coming. We appreciate. I also want to thank our personnel who have given their time towards coming here and sacrificing their time to give us opportunities and also advice. So on behalf of the youth, I think it's very important for us to understand that the youth engagement in terms of UNEP consultations is very important. So when it comes to engagement, I think the youth need to have an intergenerational dialogue, especially on equity, because we need to push forward our voice. We understand that the science policy interface has been there for 50 plus years, and we also understand that it's going to extend for the next years. And some of these consultations, negotiations, and also the resolutions, they explain the coming years as maybe 2047, the 22nd century. So we need an intergenerational discussion on the same. So in this, we also need to understand that we need platforms for the youth to express themselves when it comes to consultations. And I appreciate so much CYMG for giving the youth experts the chance to get into consultations and also acquaint themselves into these science policy panels. So it's so much amazing to understand that there is an opportunity for the youth to give out their voice, especially when it comes to the consultations. We also need to have capacity building, and I also appreciate so much IPCC, IPES, GEO, and the rest of the organizations, because they have given their time to build capacity, have fellows, engage the youth in decision making, especially in their expert panels. So these are opportunities that we as the youth need to acquit ourselves into. We need to give ourselves into. We need to be there. So it is an opportunity for us to click on these links to acquit ourselves with these people and also ensure that we are there. Finally, we need to have a youth engagement, especially in maybe having a youth expert panel. It is very considerate that we have heard that we need to have maybe a CYMG day to give awards. We also need to have inclusion. So I think we need an expert panel for the youth to ensure that even when we are giving this, even when we are giving these resolutions, we can have people who can represent as well, you see? So I think it's very important for us to also have inclusivity in these engagements, which include gender balance, which include regional balance. We have also heard of indigenous communities. We have also heard of scientists. We have also heard now of social sciences included. So we need this as an engagement of all the youth. So my suggestion is we have a CYMG expert panel, which will ensure that our focus on solutions and also consultations is put into place. So I take this opportunity to thank you so much for attending, and I urge you to continue doing the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for mentioning some of the youth priorities that we outlined in December in negotiations on the new science policy panel. And here I would like to give the word to Tessa And what would be your recommendations for us as young people, as CYMG, to prepare for the upcoming negotiations in Geneva? And how can we push for our youth priorities?
Thank you so much for inviting me today, and thank you all for attending this session. I have so many thoughts on my mind, and at the same time, I'm all ears because it's great that the youth have been very actively engaging also at the design stage now of a new panel that aims to strengthen the science policy interface, in particular here for chemicals, waste, and pollution prevention. So the recommendation that I would have is, first of all, don't just look at the road to the open-end working group number 3. Look big, look beyond. So for those of you who are not too familiar with maybe the process that the science policy panel is at, YEA 5/8, resolution 5/8, actually decided to establish a science policy panel on chemicals, waste, and the prevention of pollution, and also to convene an open-ended working group to then come up with proposals for this panel. So in June, the 3rd session of the open-ended working group is going to take place this year, and the group has been tasked to finish its work also this year. So what will be critical is that there is a foundational document on the table that can then be adopted to actually establish the panel. That comes after the work of the working group, but that will be no longer the time to actually engage on negotiations. It's a member states driven process, so the governments are in the driving seat, but there are observers welcomed, and also as the Secretariat, we have learned from the other panels a lot. So I haven't heard it. I really expected to hear it today, but when speaking about assessments and kind of the science policy interface, often it's mentioned, to have a credible, you need to have kind of a good assessment. If it's so it needs to be credible, it needs to be legitimate, and it also needs to be salient or policy relevant. And actually that policy relevant aspect is a critical one that I think you perhaps should kind of take at heart. Because this is a challenge, I think, for a lot of the science policy interfaces to ensure it's not a book on the shelf or anything that is not being used, but it's really indeed speaking to what society needs. And if you consider that in some societies, youth represent 50% of the population, that's a major force. There's a major need. There's a major policy relevance to speak to. So I just wanted to point that out in terms of sort of some of these kind of principles that a lot of the science policy interfaces work on, in terms of how to ensure that the information that is coming out of these panels are authoritative, because that's important. To policymakers, they have lots of other things to consider, but if they can get from the science authoritative information, that is key. So for the road to the open-ended working group directly, there is the opportunity still to engage on the negotiations. They mainly are focusing so far on how the panel will operate. So it's important to continue considering how do you see yourself. I think we got a lot of inspiration also from the other panels. Some of them are specifically focused on assessment, but I also want to remind you that the science policy panel has 5 functions. So it is also in a kind of an evolution that you can perhaps see from a strong focus on assessment, such as the GEO, just as the IPCC reports as well. Capacity building really has been, I think, a cornerstone of the IPES that we just heard about. And that is also something requested as one of the functions from this panel. But then there's also, what I heard a lot from other speakers as well, the function on kind of the information, dissemination, the awareness, but also the identification of gaps and the provision of up-to-date information. So I would challenge my neighbor a little bit, saying I'm completely with you that, it is really about what society needs. But whereas on the one hand, yes, science evolves, and by the time policymakers perhaps have gotten their handle on kind of incorporated it in practice, etc. There's another concern that science is not used at all. So the access to science is, I think, a very important element as well to know the strengthening of the science policy interfaces. And yeah, I think there's many roles there for early career academics, for youth, and I would just kind of defer to that particular function that the science policy have on providing up-to-date and relevant information. So this is not delinked necessarily from other work that will come out of the panel. You can, as was suggested by the IBC just now, you can take it, or like what you has been doing, take the main findings and take them out to other audiences in a targeted manner, identifying key gaps in scientific research. Be mindful that often the panels are actually assessing what is out there, not necessarily doing the research, but many of you are currently in academic institutions or may further that in future careers. And that is something that definitely in the beyond once the panels established, I think there's a big opportunity to contribute to. Encouraging and supporting communication between scientists and policymakers. That's something that we also try through these type of processes, right? That we are right now in the middle. And explaining, disseminating findings for different audiences and raising public awareness. And I think strengthening science policy interface is not new at all to UNEP, as we heard. It's been a cornerstone, but we also can work better together. So we're trying to learn a lot from the other science policy interfaces. And actually, for those of you who may be at UNEA, we do have a side event on the Wednesday evening together with the chairs of IPCC and the IPBES, also the International Resource Panel, etc. So we're also looking at what are the lessons that we can learn. I mentioned capacity building as a function for this panel as well. Well, think about the fellowship program. I'm hearing it's been sustained, seems to be successful. I hear about a stakeholder meeting, self-organized, back-to-back, with often the plenary meetings of these bodies. There is space, perhaps, that youth may wish to kind of carve out for their views. Back to the open-ended working group itself, beyond the kind of how the panel will operate discussions, we also are preparing documentation now on kind of what is the procedure or process to actually establish the priorities for the panel and create a work program. And I'm sure there's views on that from this group, and also how to kind of prepare deliverables and their clearances. And the clearances, if you have been following the process, is already something that was covered in some of our previous documentation. But the preparation of the deliverables, also in view of these functions, is something that you may want to kind of consider as a group and also respond to. So in terms of the process, there will be probably, again, regional meetings in the lead up to the open-ended working group number 3. And for those, we usually open them up for observers as well. Of course, there's always limitations, especially if they are organized as kind of in-person meetings. But then there's also a request to the secretary to organize webinars. One will be on the documentation that will be put on the table. As soon as we have the advanced English versions out, we will organize a webinar for everyone to know where they are, what is in there. And then we again are proposing that we provide the opportunity for anyone who wishes to comment on the documentation to send it to us, to the Secretariat, and we make it available online. We don't do anything with it, but any government, and we know that they're being scrutinized, are able to kind of look at, okay, these are the different views and perspectives that we see from other governments, but also from the youth groups, from NGOs, etc., on what's on the table. We also will have a webinar on capacity building, specifically. We are being asked by the Bureau to consider doing a familiarization webinar, maybe also speaking a bit more to the history, how it came about that this triple planetary crisis has a strong interface on climate, through the IPCC. We have IPBES speaking to nature and biodiversity, and to pollution. Well, this is a space where we see the science policy panel on chemicals, waste and pollution prevention come in. And then we will do a preparatory one just before the meeting in June. So these are some of the avenues in which you can engage. But as I mentioned, think beyond, because once the panel is up and running, it will start preparing its deliverables. And yes, it will go through the nomination processes. So there's a need for knowing who are the experts out there, right? And it's not perhaps always so easy for countries to nominate their key experts on a certain topic. I think there's perhaps something to think about. But also when the work needs to be done, there is a lot of scientists going to be involved. But I also want to finally stress that youth is a very diverse group. Some of you are focusing on indigenous knowledge, for example. Some of you are focusing maybe on your startup. And also going forward, I think being aware of these processes and possibly where you can come in, it's very important to bear that in mind also going forward. Because if you want to come out of the situation that we have now to make, take, and discard, and instead come to a more circular approach to prevent toxics, to pollution to end up in our environment, we need alternatives. We need also creative thinking. We also need to harness the new opportunities, but also consider the risks of it. Jet GTP geo. No, probably we don't want that. So, I mean, at the same time, disseminating, etc. Perhaps we haven't been fully kind of harnessing the opportunities that are out there. Some of you might be key communicators later on, or advisors to policymakers. So even at this point, at the main core, I already heard some reference from IPES, I think, that the youth was in their national context advising on the national biodiversity assessment. So some youth are incorporated in delegations. So of course, then there's also the processes that are ongoing. But beyond that, and as an observer, make your views known. Your perspectives are important. As in addition to the credibility, legitimacy, and policy relevance, we learned 2 lessons from the other assessments and also many studies that have been done by now. Transparency, very critical, perhaps also especially in the field in which the Science Policy Panel is going to operate, and inclusivity. And I think with that, I'll end and hand back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Tessa, for kind of summing up all the conversation that we had today. And thank you so much for encouraging us to think beyond and to be creative in our thinking, because that's true that youth is a diverse group. We have different scientists, researchers from natural science, from social sciences, behavioral science, and it is important to look beyond our current bubble that we are in and engage in all the regional consultations and all the conversations that we have with existing panels and what would be the expectations of young people. And I would also like to thank the Secretariat for always supporting us, CYMG, and encouraging our participation, and especially supporting the Youth Consultative Meeting that took place in December. That was very important for us. And just let us give you a round of applause. So we are at the end of our session. We can take 1 or 2 questions from the floor before we wrap up. Okay, you were the first one. Yes. Yes, go ahead. Yeah, I think you can just use the mic that's either behind or nearby you.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Harun Madena from Kilifi County of Kenya. I'm a network weaver of Network of the Grassroots Organization, where we are convening a network of young leaders from the marginalized regions. So I have some few things I have observed. One, it's about access to scientific knowledge. Most of the time as young people, we are really struggling to access this authentic scientific knowledge for different intervention. And we have been observing that most of our senior, they kind of hide this kind of knowledge products. I don't understand the main reason behind it. So on behalf of my fellow young people from the grassroots level, we are calling for the decentralization of this knowledge. Another thing I have observed, I'm a practitioner within gender equity, safeguarding, and social inclusion. And I've been observing there's a lot of exclusion, majority for the young people from the marginalized regions. Majority of them, they don't have enough opportunity to be part of this conversation. So we are calling for strategic support for these marginalized regions. And also we consider that young people are not only from Nairobi. We have young people from the grassroots level. They're really struggling to access this opportunity. So addressing this kind of a barrier is very important. Next point is about safeguarding issue. For this, I understand that the issue of the LGBTQ is a little bit sensitive, but also we need to think about young people who consider themselves as LGBTQ because they are human beings, and we need to treat each other as human beings and providing them safeguarding measure in this intervention. So also this is one of the crucial things. Then just to finalize, humble requesting for support of the sustainable volunteerism engagement, because we have been observing most of our seniors are encouraging us to volunteer in some different spaces, but we need to understand that we won't be young people forever. So provision of sustainable volunteerism, at least a little bit of the stipend and consideration to these marginalized groups, it's very crucial. Then the last point, it's about the visualization of this report. And this concern about the Gen Z. You'll agree with me that most of young people who consider as a Gen Z, they are not in a position to review these 500 pages report. So I'm requesting if we can come up with a measure of how we can visualize this report and see how we can meet demands of this special group. It's very crucial. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your intervention. And yeah, okay, you would one question from you and one question from you.
Hello everyone, my name is Benson and I'm from India. So my question is a general question. How, like I have done research work in the past, and I have seen like working with communities and organizations that sometimes even though like policies are being policies are there and there is a good environment, but still there is a lack of acceptance of new policies that are coming up, because so many new policies are coming up and it's really hard for grassroots communities to, accept these changes so fast. So how do you think, as a youth, we can, we can really drive this process of acceptance of new policies and initiatives from different organizations like IPCC and other agencies? Thank you so much.
Okay, let's collect one more question and then we'll give the floor to the speakers.
Hi, everyone. This is Peter Bulimo from Kenya. My question is more around the policy science interface, and I'd like to hear reflections from across board. I've interacted with a few folks here, if not many, and we are working in different thematic areas: policy advocacy, and also evidence-based implementation based on lived realities. But I've also attended several conferences, and young people usually come up with position papers and position statements that are meant to inform policy. But these are, if at all, barely adopted. And my question is why is this? Is it because we are unable to synergize across these different thematic areas and come up with a tangible output? Is it a question of design or default marginalization of the youth so that our recommendations are systemically deprioritized? Or is it a question of young people not being able to construct and present their viewpoint in a manner that makes sense to policy and decision makers. For example, are our position statement having data, the right data that informs policy? Is it evidence-backed? Or also is it a question of, what can I call it? Competing priorities, where, for example, you are aiming to achieve inclusivity, as someone pointed it, but in the process of trying to achieve inclusivity, we are bringing maybe the wrong people to, not necessarily the wrong people, but not the qualified people to design and draft our recommendations. So I'd like to hear that.
Thank you so much for this very important question. I think we are all wondering what can be an answer to this. So if I give the floor to our guest speakers, you can choose whichever question you would like to address. Yeah, Martha, yes.
Oh, so many good questions. Thank you for all of those. Let me just have a think about which one to address first. Yeah, let me address Benton's question first, I think, just because possibly it's the most straightforward for me to answer about the challenge of a lack of acceptance of new policies. So not just getting things into policies, but then making the action actually happen in response to the policies. So I think there's a few things that we can do to try and make sure that the science is translated through to policy and then into action. One of the things is on the side of the major global assessments. So people working on GEO, working on IPBES, working on IPCC and other big reports can make sure that they are including the right people and the right type of knowledges. So I think we've heard a little bit about not just using Western science, but also using alternative knowledges and using Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge, which is something that we also do at GEO. I didn't speak too much to it earlier. So we want to make sure that we have the right information in the report that's going to be relevant to not just one group of people, but all groups of people, including youth, including women, including people from marginalized communities. So we can do that. We can also make sure that we are drawing on behavioral science, which is, again, something that we do a lot in GEO to make sure that the way we are writing the report lends itself to action. It makes it clear what needs to happen. It makes it easy to translate what we're talking about into policy. I think what else can happen on the other side is that people in this room, for example, can then become champions of what we are saying in these reports. So we spoke a lot about the role of youth for disseminating the information that comes out of these reports. I think that's really, really important, because I think someone once said, if policy making is left to the policymakers, then we're not going to get very far. It needs to be policymakers. It also needs to be people in civil societies and startups and NGOs in volunteering organizations who take these recommendations and think about, okay, how do I apply this now in my community? What does this mean for the people that I live with or I work with? And that then means that we have this sort of more of like a top-down approach coming from the major global assessments, and also a community-led approach from people in this room and beyond as well. So I think, yeah, I've answered Benton's question. Let me see if anybody else wants to come in there from the panel.
Thanks very much for the questions, and I'm happy to pick up on this. I guess I will speak a little bit across, but yeah, I think what we need to understand is also how people behave and what works and what doesn't work. So, the social sciences, the behavioral sciences, they have for a long time been perhaps less recognized in some of this work, which resulted then in great recommendations, but not perhaps how to get them implemented. So there's even beyond kind of the availability of the science is also the kind of the science of how to implement things. So I think that is one element. There's also, as you rightly pointed out, there is issues by design. Is it possible to get certain views in? So often there is a scoping element in there as well, whereby both policymakers are also going to resonate with what is our priority, or what is it where we need sort of these insights and advice, but other groups as well. So other groups make up society. So in the end, if you need to have a policy, you still want to have the policy implemented as well, right? So that is a way of kind of at the design stage, preventing that you actually get something that then doesn't fall on deaf ears. I have to think often a lot about the GEO and the GEO for Youth. And yes, I was at the cradle of GEO 3, but actually when I started off working with GEO, I was actually looking after the GEO for Youth, who was then looking at the findings of GEO 2000. Because there's a lot that comes after the actual findings are there, if you want to get them grounded. So I was thinking that the theme there was really by youth for youth. It would not be sort of some sort of consultancy doing a youth publication. It would be youth saying, okay, out of this big 500 pages, your point, what is for me a priority? No, and that may not be these 500 pages, but there are things in there that you think, need to be strengthened or need to be commented on, or maybe it's even things missing. Well, that you then need to do in the stage of development. But yeah, something like this co-production of knowledge is really critical. And to some extent, that is also perhaps what we need to seek more with policymakers. So that in the co-production, the science policy interface is not, it's an iterative process. That's a later kind of insight that we learned setting up the science policy panel for chemicals waste and prevention of pollution. And then finally, one point, I think here we're all passionate about environment. I haven't heard it specifically. Society has been mentioned. It's science, policy, and society. And a lot of people, they may not immediately, the environment may not be what makes them tick. But if they realize the health dimension, which the science policy panel is, the objective is to improve sound management of chemicals and waste, prevent pollution, but for the protection of human health and the environment, or labor laws, human rights. All these other aspects are very important. So in that sense, I think also perhaps we need to learn to speak a bit more to those dimensions as well, and they go hand in hand. Thank you.
Yeah, so Mr. Pisapati, would you like to provide final remarks and we'll close the session?
Thank you. Just three very, very quick points responding to the three questions. How do we reach out to semi-urban and rural youth? There's a very specific question about what happens if I'm not in Nairobi. How do I reach out? And the best vehicle to reach out to semi-urban and rural youth are you yourself. You are the ambassadors for the youth out there. So it's the most effective way to reach out. Second point, so many policies, very confusing, very demanding in terms of time and resources. And that's why a lot of policy making today is slowly shifting. That's why I said the social sciences is really helping us to understand policy making and practicing science in a very different way. I'm sure many of you would have heard of this word called social proofing. So today, a lot of policy making happens considering social proofing. That exactly will address some elements of your concern. You don't do it in vacuum. You have to first social proof. And a lot of politicians today are using social proofing as the best mechanism to reach out. So why not? The third point is that I was quite, my attention was drawn to a nice cartoon that happened after the Dubai climate COP. And the cartoon said that if you're not on the table, you will be in the menu. So you have to be on the table at the right time, saying the right things. So it is not about how strong, how relevant, how important the message is, but how do you package that message that makes sense at the right time to the right person so that it gets absorbed. And that is why engagement is going to be extremely important. And that is why it has to be as representational as possible. Thank you.
With this, let us close the session. Thank you so much for being here, for engaging, for reflecting, for learning from us. And we hope for engaging with you even further. Thank you.
And actually, we have lunch at the main cafeteria. So please straight go there to get some.
Thank you very much.